Try this again. Boker Tov. Today's Daf Yomi is Chullin Samach Zayin, but we're going to start on Samach Vav Hamabeis around 20 lines from the bottom, where the Gemara is citing a brisa to talk to us about. We're on Samach Vav Hamabeis, and the Gemara is citing a brisa to tell us about the shratzim that are raised in waters. So we know from the pasuk that anything that has fins and scales that swims in the stream is in the seas is kosher. But if it doesn't, it says in the pasuk that you can eat those that have fins and scales, and that anything that doesn't have fins and scales in the yamim and the chom and the seas and the rivers from the shratzim, then you cannot eat. So the Gemara understands that there are four types of water bodies. That there are shratzim that are in this. These are these fish creatures, that these aquatic creatures that don't have fins and scales. If they're in the yamim and the cholim, if they're in the seas and the streams, then they're not kosher. You can't eat them. If they're in the kalim, in the utensil, the Gemara understands that you can eat those. But what about the ones that are? I'm just giving it to you in advance. The ones that are in the streams, the inlets, the outlets, the springs, those the Gemara is going to say that you cannot eat those. That we derive that from the verse. What about the ones that are in the boros, shichan, and ma'oros, the puddles, the cisterns? That the Gemara is going to say that those you can eat. So this is the discussion, and the Gemara gets there by citing the verses, because one verse says you can eat anything that has fins and scales from the water, and then another pasuk says that you cannot eat anything that does not have fins and scales. So the Gemara is going to go through this limud. Tochul mikol asher b'mayim. You can eat anything that's in the water that has fins and scales in the water. So the Gemara says mikol asher matam alomer. Why does it need to say it like this? Sheyachol. Good morning, Boker Tov. Sheyachol. You might have thought hol v'hitir b'mefurash, v'hitir b'stam. Since one, it's allowed implicitly and also explicitly. We're on 66b in the middle, around 20 lines down from the top. Since it's allowed implicitly and explicitly, so just like when it's allowed explicitly, what's allowed is the aquatic creatures that grow in the utensils. The Gemara, and this is for another discussion, but the Gemara believed in spontaneous generation. It's very clear from this text and other texts. So we don't believe in that, but the Gemara believed that certain shratzim grew in the utensils, and those were excluded from the prohibition. So just like when it's allowed explicitly, it's only allowed those that grew in the utensils. Also, when it's allowed implicitly, what's being allowed is ohiter elo b'kelim. You might have thought, also what's being allowed is only the ones that grew in the utensils. How do we know that these aquatic creatures that don't have fins and scales that grow in the cisterns and the puddles, meaning they're not spring water, but how do we know that they're also allowed? So hold on one second. How do we know that they're also allowed? I mean, now Rabbi's partial and how do I know you could drink from those puddles without being concerned they're going to be drinking a worm, because those worms would be allowed. They don't nimna, and you don't have to refrain from drinking those aquatic creatures. Tam Omer tochu mikol asher b'mayim. So you can eat anything that's in the water. That's how we derive from it. So heichon hitir b'kelim. How do we know that anything that's in a utensil is allowed? Says this is what you can eat from anything in the water, which has fins and scales. So from the fact that pasuk says anything that's in the streams and the waters, that's what's required. The key is slay, that if it has fins and scales, echol. That if it has fins and scales, you could eat it. Delay slay, if it has no fins and scales, lo techol. You can't eat it. Habakalim, the implication is that with a utensil, afagav delay slay, even though it doesn't have fins and scales, echol, you could eat it. So the Gemara says, but maybe the opposite inference is what we should learn from here. Ema bekalim, maybe in a utensil, afagav de islay, even though it has fins and scales, lo techol. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe in a utensil you can never eat it, even if it has fins and scales. So the Gemara says, no, That's not the implication. Well, because there's another pasuk which says we call anything that does not have fins and scales in the streams and the rivers mikol sheretz hamayim, from anything that goes in the water. So what's the implication? If it's in the streams and the rivers, if it doesn't have fins and scales, you can't eat it. So the implication is in a utensil, even though it has none, echol, you could eat it. Gemara says maybe it's the opposite implication. Maybe we should say b'mayim, in that maybe the pasuk tells us in the waters to teach us. That's a klal. That's a general rule. B'yamim v'nachom prat, and the streams and the rivers is a specific klal prat. Im klal masha prat. You could only whatever's in the specific is what we're referring to. Yamim v'nachom in. Maybe you can. What requires fins and scales is only the streams and the rivers. Nitzim mecharitzin lo, but the springs and inlets and the outlets, I might think that those are like the utensils. The Gemara says no. B'mayim, there's another word b'mayim at the end of the verse, chazar or klal. So it has a klal followed by a prapa, a klal, to say it's anything that's similar to the streams and the rivers, to the yamim and the nechoam, anything that's similar to that. So the Gemara says, but wait 1 second, we can't apply this principle of klal prat to klal. Why? These two general rules are right next to each other. It's not a klal prat to klal, it's a klal and then prat. It's general, then specific. So the Gemara says, Amaravina kedamri b'marava. No, that's also klal prat to klal. Anytime you have two klalim, two generalities that are right next to each other, hatel prat b'neim, put the specific in between them, medunam b'klal prat to klal, and we're on 67a, and then you could still derive it as a klal prat to klal. Gemara says, b'mayim is a klal, b'yamim v'nachom is a prat, b'mayim chazer klal. So we have a klal followed by a specific, followed by another klal. Klal prat to klal, yatadan elkeino prat. So it's anything that's similar to the specific. Ma prat mafurish mayim novim, just like the specific is anything that flows, a spring water, a stream or a sea. Av kol mayim novim. Also, anything that flows, those types of creatures require fins and scales. My Rabbi, what's it coming to include? Charitzin v'nitzin, the springs and the inlets and the outlets. Uisura, that if they don't have fins and scales, it's prohibited. My mi'et, what's being excluded? The boros shichon u'ma'oros, the puddles, the cisterns, that they don't require fins and scales on those creatures that are raised in there or grow in there. The Gemara says, why don't I say the opposite? Ma prat mefurosh. Maybe just like this prat is something specific. Mayim gedeon al gabe karka. It's water that is above the ground. So therefore, avkol mayim gedeon al gabe karka. Maybe it comes to include any water that's above the ground. My Rabbi, and what's it coming to include? A few barashich. Maybe even the cisterns require fins and scales. So the Gemara says, Uisura. So the Gemara says, Umay mi'et kelim, and it's telling us only utensils that if they don't have fins and scales are permitted. The Gemara says, Imkein tochu maya haile. No, the word tochu is coming to include something that's coming to include the cisterns. Okay, so now the Gemara says we're going to learn the same idea. There are two ways, generally speaking, the Gemara, multiple ways, but two very similar ways of deriving from generality and specifics that are slightly different, but we won't need their distinction in this case. And one is klal prat to klal, and the other is riboy u'miut, an amplification followed by a limitation. So the Tana de Be'er Shmuel learned the same law from a riboy u'miut. Be'er Shmuel Tana b'mayim shtei pamim. It says this amplification of water twice. Ein zeh klal prat ela ribo mi'et. So this is not what's called a klal prat. This is what's called an amplification followed by a limitation. B'mayim riba. So the first b'mayim is an amplification. B'mayim u'b'nechalim mi'et. Then the seas and the streams, that's a limitation. B'mayim chazar v'riba. So then the last b'mayim or the second b'mayim comes and does another amplification. Riba u'miot v'riba. So riba kol, it's coming to include even more. It's coming to include even more. So what's included in this in the idea that it needs fins and scales if it's in the water. My Rabbi, it's including not only the streams, not only the seas, but also the charitzim and the v'ni'itzim l'isura. That also the springs. Umay. What's excluding from the requirement of fins and scales? Borosh shichlim ma'oros that they're allowed, the cisterns. The Gemara says, but maybe not like that. Maybe what's it including? Borosh shichlim ma'oros. Maybe the cisterns are what's being prohibited. My miyate, and what's it excluding that it doesn't need a kalim? Gemara says the same idea. Imkain tochu ma'ahanilei. No, if that's the case, what is the word tochu in that verse coming to teach us? That's coming to teach us, in addition to the kalim, it's coming to teach us the borosh shichlim ma'oros. Gemara says, ve'epochana. But the Gemara says, but maybe we should learn the exact opposite, that anything that's in the Borosh Shichlim Ma'oros requires fins and scales, and what's limiting is those that grow in the Charitzin and the Itzin. Maybe that's what's being limited. Means to say maybe the cisterns are the ones that are always prohibited, even if it grows in there, and the Ni'itzin are the ones, the springs are the ones that are permitted. Why not reverse it? The Gemara says we're not going to say that. Keditani Matisya, Ditani Matisya Bar Yehuda is unusual. I don't know how often he appears in the Shas. He appears. I don't know how often. According to Sefer Yochson, which is he was a student of Shmuel. So Matisya Bar Yehuda says, why are we saying that if these shkatzim grow, or the shratzim grow in the cisterns are permitted, but if they grow in the streams, they're prohibited? It's logical. The cisterns are a closed loop, like the utensils. So therefore, they're also going to be permitted if they grow in there. And I'm going to exclude the springs, that they're not closed. They have inlets and outlets, so they're not closed like the utensils. So the Gemara says, quoted to this, I saw some I'm a first. Which one is implicit? Which one is explicit? I'm not really sure what the nafkamina is here. Like, why does it matter? But there's two psukim, and one of them is implicit and one is explicit. So Puigi bar Ravacha v'Ravida Chan Amar Yeshal Mefurash. The pasuk that says that if it has fins and scales, that's the one that's explicit. The Einlo, but if it doesn't have, if the one that doesn't have, that's the one that's some that's implicit. V'chad Amar Einlo, the pasuk that says if it doesn't have fins and scales, that's a mefurish. V'yeshlo sasim. My time demand Amar Yeshlo b'mefurish. What's the reason for the one who says that if it has fins and scales, that's the explicit one? Meaning to say, we see from here that the kalim and the boros are permitted, even if it doesn't have. My time of demand Amar Yeshlo b'mefurish. Amacham minehu to come mishtaru kalim. From this pasuk, we see that if it has that the streams and the rivers requires fins and scales, but that's explicit that if they don't have not a stream and a river, it doesn't require fins and scales. My time I demand the Amar Ein Lo Mefurish. What's the reason for the one who says that the pasuk that says if it doesn't have fins and scales, you can't eat it if it's from a stream and a river? What's the reason why the one who says that that's the one that's explicit? The hayu dekamukach, the hayi dekamukach ahayach. Because from this pasuk we learn that what the first verse was allowing. The imei hayach, because if we're going to learn it from the first verse, Havamina would have said b'kelam afagav the islay not milotecho. I could have learned the opposite. I would have said that if it's fins and scales in the streams and rivers, you could eat it. But in a utensil, even if it has fins and scales, you can't eat it. So it's only the second pasuk that tells us that you cannot eat it if it's in the streams and the rivers. But in utensils, you could eat it. So, but I'm not sure what the nafkamina is, or if there is even a nafkamina between the two approaches, because it's the same conclusion we have. The Gemara concludes, according to all these positions, that these shratzim that grow, quote unquote, in the cisterns or in the utensils are going to be permitted, but if they grow in the streams and in the springs and in the seas, then they're prohibited unless they have fins and scales. Amar Rav Huna. So now there's another law which we learned about shratzim, which is if the sheretz grows on in a utensil, or if it grows without ever touching the ground, it's permitted. But if it ever touched the ground, then it's going to be prohibited. So I'm Rafuna. Well, lishvi in a shichra b'tzivyasa b'orta. You shouldn't strain out your beer, your date beer, at night over the wood. You shouldn't do that. Because this is the date beer which has worms in it. You shouldn't strain it out at night. Dilma parish la'el mitzavyasa, v'ader nafal akasa, because maybe these worms, which are in the dates, so while they're in the date beer, it's permitted, but maybe they're going to separate and go into the wood, and then it'll go back into your cup. And then have it over mishum sheretz hasharet haaretz. Meaning, if you're not watching it, you're not going to be aware that it jumped from the beer where it was permitted because it was never on the ground to the wood where it was prohibited. It says b'mana nami. Well, we should also say if it's in the utensil, it should always be prohibited. Even if it should always be prohibited. Dilma parshed l'dafna demana v'ader nafal mana. Maybe it jumped from within the utensil to the wall of the utensil and then back. So it's like it's on the ground. Gemara says, no, Hasim Hainu Ravisa, that's the standard growth. That's the standard way in which it grows. And so therefore it's not considered like it ever went on the ground. Gemara says, Umana Tamer, how do we know this distinction? That if it's a standard way in which it's growing, it's going to be still permitted. How do we know that you're allowed to drink from these cisterns, even though they have tolayim, they have these creepy crawling creatures in them? You don't have to stop. Because it says you can eat whatever is in the water, meaning to say whatever grew in those cisterns is permitted. How is it allowed? Maybe it jumped to the wall and then it came back. So in the case of cisterns, that's the way it grows, and also over here in the beer, so this is the way it grows. I have a brisa, Tanya the Messiah. I have a brisa that supports you. Rabos, it says that you're not allowed to eat anything that crawls on the ground. Rabos, you have kushin. This comes to include, you're also prohibited to eat those like gnats that you filtered out from the wine. Time of the synonym. The reason why it's prohibited is because you filtered them out. But if you never filtered them out, then they went on the ground or something. But if you never filter them out, then they're sherry, then they're permitted. And so that's the source for this idea. Amar Shmuel, so now we have actually this we had earlier in our chapter of Elu Trefos. Kishus Shetliya, let's have a cucumber that became wormy Ba'avia, while it's still attached to the ground. That's Asura, because there the bugs are on the ground. Mishum Hasheret Hasheret Aretz. But if it had grown wormy while it's in a utensil, we said earlier, then it's permitted because the sheretz was never on the ground. Maybe there's a support for this. Because we have two prices that contradict each other. And again, one verse says, "Our aretz," anything that crawls on the ground, you can't eat, meaning only on the ground. This comes to exclude the gnats that are found in the lentils, which will be permitted because they're never on the ground. And the little mosquitoes in the chickpeas, and the worms in the dates and the figs because they were never on the ground. But and the other verse says you can't eat what crawls on the ground. The rabos Torah should be kari zaytim, it should be kari gfanim. It comes to include you're not allowed to eat the worms on the olive trees and the grapevines. So one case is excluding it and one case is including. So what's the distinction? So aren't we saying that both of them referring to fruits? One's while it's attached to the ground, it's going to be prohibited. But if it grew while it's not attached to the ground, then it's going to be permitted. The Gemara says no. Both of them are while they're still attached to the ground. One is on the fruit. In that case, that's allowed because it was never. That's not considered attached to the ground, unlike a cucumber, which is. But a fruit is on the tree; it's removed. And one is on the tree itself. That's going to be while it's on the ground, and the creepy crawly creature is prohibited. They could not. I mean, indeed, we have an inference to this. They could tani Torah shabikari zaysim. It says the worms that are in the roots of the olive tree and the grapevines, those are not the fruit, but the roots, those are prohibited shmamina. So now we have a few questions which the Gemara is going to ask, which we don't know the answer to. But Rav Yosef, let's say this toas, this worm, perisha umesa. It fell off the fruit, but before it hit the ground, it died. So is that going to be considered like it walked on the ground? Mahu. Can you eat it? Do we say it never walked on the ground, or do we say it walked on the ground, therefore it's prohibited? What about miktsasa? Let's say half of it hit the ground before the entire worm died. Mahu. Okay. Let's say it didn't hit the ground, but it jumped from the fruit and was in the air, and then it got died. The person caught it while it's still in the air and ate it. Do we say since it never hit the ground, it's permitted, or do we say since it's no longer on the fruit, it's prohibited? Take it. All these questions are unresolved. By Rav Ashi, let's say it moved in the fruit from the middle of the fruit to the outside of the date, or to the outside of the grape. So what would be the law in all these cases? Or to the outside of the seed? Okay. Rashi thought, is what Rashi writes. Sometimes we have science and we just don't understand how our great sages understood it differently. Rashi writes, all these tolayim, these insects, they grow from the fruit of the seed of the fruit, the pit of the fruit. We know that's not true, but I mean that was the best they did with their understanding around them. These are the worms that are in the liver and the lungs of an animal. Asiri, they're prohibited. My timer. Why? Because those didn't grow inside the animal. Me'alma, so those came from outside the animal. So maske for Ravashi, me'alma. So if they came from outside the animal, then we should find them in the digestive tract. We should find them defecating them, and we don't. And so therefore that's a proof that they come from inside the animal and they're permitted, because if it's from outside the animal, they would be normal digestion. You get the alternative version, the opposite. These worms are sharo. These worms that you find in the liver or the lungs of the animal are permitted. My taima, mine gavwe, because these worms, they grow in the animal itself, and that's where they're created, and they never went on the earth, and so they're permitted. This is a question. Hold on, I'll just finish this. I'm Rav Ashi. Pshita, it's obvious, it's obvious that they it's obviously the case that they come from inside the animal, because if they came from outside the animal, it's the you would have found it in the digestion. The law is kukiani asiri. These worms are prohibited in my taima because because we are concerned that maybe the animal was sleeping, and while it was sleeping, it went up through its nose. Okay, so that's probably what happened, actually. Next case, Tolayim Darni. These are the worms that are found between the skin and the meat when you skin the animal, the bisra, or those that are found in the flesh of the animal, atsire. Those are going to be prohibited because we assume they came from outside. But the kavari, but those that are found in the fish are sharian, they're permitted. What's the difference? But we'll see in a moment. Ravina said to his mother, Avuli, take these tolayim that grow inside the fish. You can prepare for me. I don't want to see it. If I see it, I'll be disgusted by it, and then I'll be a prohibition called bal teshaktu. But prepare it for me, and then I'll eat it, and then I'll be all good. You get disgusted, not me. Why is this allowed? Why are the tolayim in the fish allowed, whereas it says from the meat you can't eat it? What's the difference between the tolayim in the fish and tolayim in the animal? It's not the same. The animal which is allowed through shchita, hani. So since these worms, shlita doesn't help them, therefore they're prohibited. But dagim, but fish, they don't require shlita. But stipa ba'alma mystery, they just permitted when you don't need shlita. So therefore, hani Ki gavon be'tera kagavon. So therefore, when you bring them in, you wrap them up together, and so therefore it's permitted. They don't require shlita. There was a big controversy about worms that you found in salmon. You have these little microscopic creatures that go into the salmon, and then they grow, and then you cut up the fish, and then there are worms in there. And then if you don't care, this could be a big question because most people, they just mix it up with all the other salmon and it's all good. But if we cook it and we care about it, so here it would be permitted unless you say, well, obviously we know that those worms are not growing inside the salmon; they came from outside. But you can look it up afterwards. The little worms in salmon kosher. Tan Rabbanan holech al gachon. So it says in the pasuk, anything that goes on its belly, or anything that goes on four legs, or anything that goes on a lot of legs, a centipede, you cannot eat because it's sheketim. Holech al gachon. It says the word kol. Anything that goes on, the word kol is added here. So it's all coming to include holech al gachon. That's a nachash. Kol, rabbas hashilshal, comes to include a worm. Ve'es hadomel hashilshal, and anything similar to that worm. Al arba, what goes on for is the akrev. This is the scorpion. The kol, everything that goes. Rabbas is a chipushis, to include the chipushis. Ve'es hadomel chipushis, whatever is similar to that. Marbe raglayim, whatever has a lot of legs, and not the centipede. Ad kol, larabos as adoma udoma. Anything that's similar to the centipede. Now we go to the last piece of this chapter. We've done this chapter now for 3 weeks. Eutrefus, this beautiful chapter about what's kosher, what's not kosher, and the Gemara concludes with the incredible halacha. So Tanya Rabbi Yossi ben Dur Maskis Omer Haliv Yasan Dag Tahor. The Leviathan is a kosher fish because it has fins and scales, as it states. Ga'ava afike maginim tachtav chadudei cheres, meaning to say, underneath the Leviathan, when it rests, there are very sharp fins, like shards of pottery. And the pasuk is going back and saying that the Leviathan, because it's so strong, its scales, even when it's lying down on iron, from its strength, it gets crushed underneath him. So he's got scales, and tachtav chadude cheres, and he has these fins that are very sharp. Afiku maganim elu kaskasim shabo. These are its scales. Tachtav chadude cheres elu snapirin sheparech b'hem. These are the fins that he flies with or swims with. There's a hadron al but there's a big problem here. Why does the Gemara need to tell us that the Leviathan is kosher when God Himself, we're told, is going to feed the Leviathan to the tzaddikim? And so why do we need the Gemara to bring a proof? Isn't Hashem Yisbarach the best mashkiach that exists? God is the mashkiach. So I was thinking like this, that it's just trying to tell us when it comes to laws of kashrus and treifos, we come to this end of this chapter about Elu treifos, trust but verify. Even God, we have to prove that what God is serving us is kosher, even what's in heaven. Anyway, that's today's daf yomi. And tomorrow the new parak is a totally different topic, and the parak is discussing behema amakasha behema maksha the behema. And this is the story of the ben pakua, the fetus that was found in an animal after you slaughtered it. Okay, so anyway, we'll stop here. Baruch Hashem, we'll continue later.